Everyone, thank you so much for joining us again. I know some folks are just dialing in, but we're going to go ahead and get started just to respect everyone's time. So welcome to the City of San Diego Climate Action Plan Review Committee meeting. I would like to remind everyone to please mute yourself until you are recognized to speak so that we can minimize any background noise. It is 3:03 on May 11th, 2022, and I call the San Diego Climate Action Plan Review Committee meeting to order. Until further notice, the Climate Action Plan Review Committee meetings will be conducted pursuant to Government Code Section 54953E, added by Assembly Bill 316, which allows the city to use teleconferencing and to provide the public an opportunity to address the committee via a call-in option or an internet-based service option during a proclaimed state of emergency. We have made arrangements for the public to comment using the Zoom webinar. You'll see that on the screen there, and we'll go over that in just a moment. Before we do, let me now call roll. As we did last time, hopefully without any sort of typos, I will call your name and affiliation, and please unmute yourself and say present when I do. Alejandro Amador with Casa Familiar.
Present.
Thank you. Jason Anderson, Clean Tech San Diego. I'm present. DK Andrew with the San Diego Regional Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, good afternoon, present.
Thank you. Maxi Blasini with the Climate Action Campaign.
Present.
Thank you. Bernadette Buckowitz, SDG&E. Emily Caldwell, San Diego Building Industry Association.
Present.
Thank you. Nate Fairman, IBEW 465. Sophia Haidari with YouthWill.
Present.
Thank you. Kyle Heskala with the Environmental Health Coalition.
Present.
Thank you. Doug Hicks, Southwest Regional Council of Carpenters. Cody Hooven, San Diego Community Power. Dr. Julie Kanaski, Scripps Institution of Oceanography. Carol Kim, San Diego Building Trades and Construction Council. Cindy Lynn, Business for Good. I think you said present, Cindy. I think you're muted.
I did. I'm present.
There you are. Thank you. Valentin Macedo, Labor's International Union of North America, Local 89.
Present.
Thank you. Bruce Mayberry, County of San Diego Black Chamber of Commerce.
Present.
Thank you, Bruce. Andrew Meyer, San Diego Audubon Society.
Present.
Thank you. Jesse O'Sullivan, Circulate San Diego.
Present.
Thank you. Eddie Price, San Diego Urban Sustainability Coalition.
Here.
Thank you. I see Carol Kim just logged on. Carol Kim, San Diego Building Trades and Construction Council. Just calling roll, Carol.
Here. Thank you.
I think I got everyone for now.
I think you might have skipped Bridget.
Is she on? I called her. Oh, Bridget Browning. Sorry, San Diego and Imperial Counties Labor Council. All right. Moving on. All right, before we get into today's agenda, Joe, can you please explain the guidelines for today's meeting? Before you do that, Joe, I know that Bernadette just joined us. So Bernadette, can you just indicate that you're here by saying present? She's still connecting to audio. Joe, go ahead.
Members of the public can join the meeting by computer, tablet, or smartphone by accessing the link which is listed on the meeting notice and agenda on the city's webpage. To join the Zoom webinar by telephone, please dial 1-669-254-5252. When prompted, input meeting ID 161-203-2837#. This information is also available on the agenda. When the item is introduced that you would like to comment on, raise your hand by either tapping the raise your hand icon on your computer, tablet, or smartphone, or dialing *9 on your phone. You will be taken in the order in which your hand was raised. You may speak only once on a particular item. When staff indicates it is your turn to speak, I will call you by your name as it appears in the Zoom webinar attendee list, or I will read out the last 4 digits of the phone number if you have called into the meeting. This is how you will know it is your turn to speak. Click the unmute prompt that will appear on your computer, tablet, or smartphone, or dial *6 on your phone. If you are participating by phone, please mute your TV or computer when it is your turn to speak. Please raise your hand during the item on which you wish to speak. If you raise your hand during a non-comment period, your hand will be lowered. And back to you, Jason.
Thanks, Joe. And can you please note that Bernadette Buckowitz with SDG&E has joined the meeting. All right, so let's move on to agenda item number 3, non-agenda public comment. This is the time for members of the public to address the Climate Action Plan Review Committee on any matter of interest that is within the committee's jurisdiction, but is not on the agenda. Each speaker during non-agenda public comment will be limited to 1 minute, and a total of 16 minutes will be allocated for non-agenda public comment, or until the speaker queue has been exhausted, whichever comes first. Please note that committee members and city staff will not be responding to comments or answering the questions during non-agenda public comment, and pursuant to the Ralph M. Brown Act, no discussion or action other than a referral shall be taken during non-agenda public comment. Joe, do we have any non-agenda public comment?
Just as a reminder, and seeing no dial-in participants, I would ask anyone that wishes to participate in non-agenda public comment to raise your hand now. Seeing no hands. Back to you, Jason.
All right, non-agenda public comment is closed. Thank you. Agenda item 4, approval of minutes. As part of the calendar invite and in advance of this meeting, the committee members received a copy of the minutes from our last meeting, which was held on May 11th, 2022. Before we approve those, I wanted to ask members of the committee, and Joe, if you can make note that Cody Hubin with San Diego Community Power is present, but wanted to turn it over to ask any members of the committee if there's any questions or comments on the committee minutes from our May 11th meeting. Please raise your hand if you do. All right, seeing no hands, can I get a motion from a member of the committee for adoption of our May 11th committee meeting minutes?
So moved.
Carol Kim moves. Thank you, Carol. Can I get a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. Business Good for Good seconds. Joe, let me ask real quick. Do I need to go through the roll call to approve the minutes, or can this be done by a collective voice aye?
Voice aye is acceptable.
Okay, so we've got a motion on by Carol Kim, second by Cindy Lynn, in support of the adoption of the minutes from May 11th. Everyone agrees, please say aye.
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 Any nays? Hearing none, any abstentions? All right, and my vote is yay. Thank you. The adoption of the minutes, or the minutes have been adopted. All right, before we move on to the 2 information items on the agenda this afternoon, let me remind everyone per a question and some comments from last meeting that if any individual organizations would like to make or planning to make, if you already haven't, comments on the draft plan, city staff would actually like those as soon as possible. And by that, I think they mean sometimes this week, if at all possible. So if you are planning, again, this is individually as an organization, not collectively as this committee meeting. We're as a collective are up against the June 6th deadline. But if any individual organizations that are part of this committee or even just the public want to submit comments, please do that as soon as possible, and you can just send those directly to Mariah with the City of San Diego. And Mariah, if you wouldn't mind just dropping your email in the chat so people have that. And as a reminder, this is, again, is just for your individual organizations. We as a committee will be working on, excuse me, our feedback and comments, and we will get those into the committee hopefully by June 6th. Any questions there? All right. Okay, so let's move on to agenda item 5. This is the Climate Action Plan Consistency Regulations. We've got Rebecca Malone, Environmental Policy Program Manager with the Public Planning Department, will be joining us, as well as Interim Deputy Director of the Planning Department, Kelly Stanko. Rebecca, can I turn it over to you?
Yes.
There you are. It's all yours.
Excellent. And it'll just be me, although Kelly, I think, is here, but I'll be presenting the CAP consistency regulations today.
Okay.
Good afternoon. as I was just introduced, I'm the Environmental Policy Program Manager for the Planning Department, and I will be providing information about the CAP consistency regulations. First off, how and why we decided on what would go into the regulations. And after that, I will go into the details of the new regulations. To start out, how did we get here? In accordance with the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, public agencies may choose to analyze and mitigate significant greenhouse gas emissions in a plan for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which may then be used in cumulative impact analysis for GHG emissions in subsequent environmental documents. Basically, if you have a qualified GHG reduction plan, subsequent environmental documents like EIRs or negative declarations can reference the GHG reduction plan for their analysis of GHG emissions. CEQA Guidelines Section 15183.5 includes a list of items that a plan for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions should include. One requirement is that the plan specify measures or a group of measures, including performance standards, that substantial evidence demonstrates, if implemented on a project-by-project basis, would collectively achieve the specified emissions level. The CAP consistency checklist is currently satisfying this requirement. For both the 2016 CAP consistency checklist and this current effort, city staff use similar methods to determine what should be included as CAP consistency measures. The main differences are as follows. The 2016 CAP consistency checklist only applied to discretionary projects. Ministerial projects did not have to demonstrate compliance with the CAP. The CAP consistency regulations, on the other hand, the new effort that will accompany the CAP update will apply to all projects, excluding some smaller projects, which I will go over in a moment. The measures in the 2016 CAP consistency checklist were primarily derived from the 2013 California Green Building Code voluntary measures, and many are now required by since updated Cal Green codes. The proposed CAP consistency regulations, however, are amendments to our land development code that were developed through coordination with city staff and with input from stakeholders. Sorry, I am off on slides. So next slide, actually. As with the 2016 CAP consistency checklist, the CAP strategies were reviewed to determine what could be made into a measure that would be implemented on a project-by-project basis. It is important to note that the city is taking a comprehensive approach to implementing the CAP update. The CAP consistency regulations will only be one element of the CAP implementation. There will be other actions the city takes that apply to new development. For example, the Sustainability Department, with input from stakeholders, is actively developing a building code amendment to implement Strategy 1 and decarbonize new buildings. This amendment will establish standards for new development to phase out natural gas and reduce energy use. So, to avoid conflicts with those ongoing efforts, the CAP consistency regulations do not include requirements for building decarbonization with this particular action. As the building code amendment is finalized and adopted, new development will contribute its fair share to implement Strategy 1 under the provisions of a different section of the city's municipal code. These actions collectively will help achieve CAP goals and targets and are intended to work together. The CAP consistency regulations focus on capturing code or policy gaps where an existing or foreseeable action is not currently otherwise anticipated. Next slide. As mentioned before, the CAP consistency regulations are replacing the CAP consistency checklist as the list of measures that can be implemented on a project-by-project basis. And the draft GHG significance determination threshold reflects this change. The initial study questions, the questions being answered in an environmental document, will remain the same, but now project level significance will be determined through land use consistency and project compliance with the CAP consistency regulations, instead of demonstrating consistency through the use of the CAP consistency checklist. Projects that do not comply with the CAP consistency regulations must prepare a comprehensive project-specific analysis of GHG emissions, including quantification of existing and projected GHG emissions and incorporation of the measures in the CAP consistency regulations to the extent feasible. Cumulative GHG impacts would be significant for any project that is not consistent with the CAP. Next slide. Now we will get into the CAP consistency regulations themselves. This slide provides an overview of the CAP consistency regulations, which we will explore in greater detail. As we've noted previously, the CAP consistency regulations will replace the existing CAP checklist in its entirety. Unlike the CAP checklist, which applied only to discretionary applications, the CAP consistency regulations will apply to both ministerial and discretionary permit applications. The reason for this is twofold. First, when we adopt comprehensive pro-housing policies, we need regulations in place to streamline approval of the underlying policy initiatives. Second, since the CAP was first updated, the city has streamlined project approval processes by eliminating many discretionary requirements and shifting to ministerial by right approvals. It is important to ensure that these increased number of ministerial applications comply with the CAP. Projects that comply with the CAP consistency regulations will be determined to comply with and implement the CAP. Projects that do not comply with the CAP consistency regulations will require a Process 2 neighborhood development permit with deviation findings. Next slide. Projects that will be subject to the regulations include residential development that results in 3 or more total dwelling units, non-residential development that results in 5,000 square feet or more of occupied gross floor area, and parking facilities as a primary use. Next slide. The CAP consistency regulations related to mobility and land use regulations include 2 regulations addressing pedestrian enhancements. The first requires that 50% of the sidewalk adjacent to a development be shaded by planting street trees in the furnishing zone, also known as the parkway, or the street yard, with priority placed on the furnishing zone. The shade coverage of a tree will be based on the expected canopy of the selected species at 10-year maturity. If a tree cannot be provided on site, either due to a lack of a furnishing zone and street yard, the applicant may select one of 2 alternatives. Off-site planting within 1 mile with a property owner agreement for ongoing maintenance, or payment of the urban tree canopy fee to be placed in the newly established Climate Resiliency Fund. The fee, which reflects the cost to the city to plant and maintain a tree for 3 years, is $725 per 30 feet of street frontage. Next slide. The second regulation related to pedestrian enhancements is a new pedestrian-oriented regulation that requires properties with 250 linear feet or more of street frontage to provide at least 1 pedestrian amenity for every 250 linear feet of street frontage. Options currently include trash and recycling containers, seating, pedestrian lighting, public artwork, community wayfinding signs, or enhancement of a transit stop within 1,000 feet. Staff is continuing to work with the building industry to identify additional options for pedestrian enhancements. Next slide. The CAP consistency regulations also include mobility and land use regulations addressing bicycle enhancements, which state that 50% of all required residential and non-residential bicycle parking spaces be supplied with individual outlets for electrical charging. Next slide. The last regulation addresses resilient infrastructure and healthy ecosystems through enhancement of the urban tree canopy. Building on other recently adopted regulations, the CAP consistency regulations requires 2 trees to be provided on site for every 5,000 square feet of lot area, with a minimum of 1 tree. Existing trees can be used to satisfy this requirement. However, trees provided in the street yard to satisfy the sidewalk shading requirement, of the cap consistency regulations cannot be used to satisfy this urban canopy requirement. If the base zone in which the project is located does not require open space of sufficient size to plant the trees on site, the applicant may select one of two alternatives. Off-site planting within 1 mile of a property owner agreement for ongoing maintenance, or payment of the urban tree canopy fee to be placed in the newly established Climate Resiliency Fund. The applicant would also have the option under the regulations of providing the required trees within planters on podium construction. Next slide. Projects that cannot comply with one or more of the cap consistency regulations will require a neighborhood development permit, process 2, that includes the following supplemental findings. First, that the proposed deviation is the minimum necessary to afford relief from special circumstances or conditions of the land, not of the applicant's making. And second, that the development provides project features or other mitigating measures to the extent feasible that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and support and enhance alternative forms of transit in a manner comparable to compliance with the Climate Action Plan consistency regulations. Next slide. A brief note on the environmental review that was performed for the entire CAP package, the update itself, CAP consistency regulations, and the GHG significance determination threshold. The environmental policy section in the planning department determined that the appropriate environmental document for this project is an addendum to the 2015 CAP final program EIR. In preparing the 2015 EIR, we went through the thought exercise of what the potential environmental impacts from enacting the CAP would be, such as large-scale solar and its transmission or changes to mobility circulation systems. Basically, what are physical changes to the environment we could expect from the implementation of the Climate Action Plan? The 2015 EIR outlines significant impacts to visual effects and neighborhood character, air quality, historic resources, and transportation and circulation. The addendum to the 2015 CAP EIR goes issue area by issue area to explain why impacts from the CAP update and implementing actions would not be greater than what was analyzed in the 2015 CAP EIR. Next slide. On April 26, 2022, the Community Planners Committee reviewed the same aspects of the Climate Action Plan update package and voted 23-2 to approve the updated GHG thresholds and Climate Action Plan consistency regulations as presented by staff. Comments from the CPC focused primarily on other steps the city could take related to GHG emissions reductions and concern that the regulations do not go far enough in furthering the goals of the CAP. Next slide. And on May 5th, the Planning Commission recommended that the City Council certify the addendum to the CAP EIR, approve the updated GHG thresholds within the CEQA significance thresholds of the Land Development Manual, and approve the new Climate Action Plan consistency regulations amendments to the San Diego Municipal Code. Next slide. And yeah, I think we're done. This concludes my presentation, and I'm available for questions.
Thank you. Before we get to committee member questions, let me open it up to the public. Joe, do we have any comment from the public on this item?
We do have, one hand up, which is Brenda Garcia Milan.
Brenda, you're recognized to make your comment.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is Brenda Garcia Millan with Climate Action Campaign. We're just calling to express our concern that the CAP update may not meet CEQA standards due to a lack of details in its measures, actions, and implementation. We thank the city for setting more aggressive goals to stop the climate crisis. However, CEQA sets clear requirements for CAPs to provide detailed and specific evidence on how mitigation will be achieved in exchange for project development streamlining. And based on the draft CAP update, we do not believe the city currently meets those requirements. Therefore, we recommend that the CAP consistency regulations incorporate project level GHG reductions, details how it will achieve said reductions, and approve the CAP update concurrently with a clear implementation and funding plan with associated costs. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other members of the public wishing to make comment, please raise your hand. All right, Joe, I don't see any. Joe, any on your end?
No hands are raised right now, but we do have a new dial-in guest, so I will read off the instructions just one more time. For those of you who would like to raise your hand on a tablet, computer, or smartphone, please do so by hitting the Raise Your Hand tab. If you are calling in, please dial *9 on your phone. No additional hands raised.
All right. And no additional call-ins, is that correct?
We do have one call-in. I just wanted to acknowledge that, but the hand has not been raised. *9 for our call-in guest. Oh, and that did it. No, sorry, but we do have a hand raised.
Hang on one second, Carol, if you don't mind. I think we're waiting for public comment and then we'll open it up to committee questions.
That's Carol. Okay, I think it's safe to close.
And just real quick, Joe, to clarify, that phone number is actually from Andrew Meyer with the Audubon. He had to switch from his computer over to his phone. So that's him if you want to rename him on your side. All right, I see no other public comment. I'm going to close public comment on this item and open it up to questions or comments from the committee members. We may want to go back real quick on the slides, Mariah. There may be some questions as it relates to some of Rebecca's presentation. So Carol, I want to recognize you for a question.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So regarding the CAP consistency regulations, does meeting the consistency requirements actually provide by right approval? Do we have any sense of that yet?
So they would be applied to, so the CAP consistency regulations would be applied to all projects. It would have nothing to do with whether or not your project was by right. I guess if you weren't meeting the CAP consistency regulations and you were a by right project, but then you weren't going to meet the CAP consistency regulations, you would be knocked out of that. You would then have to get a neighborhood development permit, but yeah, they are intended to apply to all projects.
And Carol, just to add on to Becky's response, so the checklist does not change a project from a discretionary process within the city to a by right. It is just applied by municipal code to all projects.
Gotcha. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carol. Emily.
Thank you for the presentation and very excited for the updates. I've many a times struggled with the previous checklist, so I'm very excited about it. Just a couple of quick, I think probably more nuts and bolts questions just because I'm curious. First, I wanted to ask how the strategies will play into the mobility choices. I know that sometimes there was, the old CAP consistency, they were just different enough. Is there been any consideration in how those play into mobility choices regulations?
I'm not sure I really understand the question, how the CAP consistency regulations will interact with the mobility choices.
Yeah, like for instance, if you're in mobility zone 2, it says, provide a bike charging station, but then the CAP consistency would say provide a bike parking station. So it was just kind of this, putting a square into a round hole to try to kind of meet the requirements of both.
Kelly Stonko, Interim Deputy Director in the Planning Department. We did look at other existing programs that we have as well, such as mobility choices, and try to avoid redundancies or conflicts unless they were intentional, where compliance with one regulation also satisfied another. If there is a particular redundancy that you identify that we may have missed or a conflict, we're happy to take a look at that and try and provide any clarification now before it goes through the process.
Understood. No, thank you. And then my other question was just if there's been any consideration for projects that are immediately discretionary and then move into the ministerial building permit process, if there's any kind of streamlining since they've already kind of gone through the CAP consistency and the CAP regulations. Is there any consideration for kind of streamlining that since they'll be kind of back-to-back approvals?
So because the regulations apply to both discretionary and ministerial projects, a project going through at the discretionary phase, the planner will be reviewing that project for compliance with these regulations and ensuring that they comply, so that when it comes to the ministerial phase, so long as the project continues to implement those measures in the way it proposed to during the discretionary process, that yes, should streamline that process because the project has already been determined to comply at the discretionary phase.
Got it. Okay. And then, sorry, one more, and then I promise I'm done. I know the previous consistency checklist kind of excluded, land use actions, things like just a tentative map with no associated site plan. Is that still the case? Or now that it's, I know there's kind of the blanket statement of discretionary. So has that changed?
So we did identify the projects that would trigger review for the CAP consistency regulations. We did not include straight mapping actions or other things that we do not anticipate would cause significant GHG. We try to focus on those projects that would and offsetting those through the regulations. So that's why the trigger for compliance with the CAP consistency regulations is the residential projects of 3 that result in 3 or more dwelling units, the commercial development that results in 5,000 square feet or more of total gross floor area, or parking facilities as a primary use. Those being the ones we see as the biggest contributors to GHG.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Maxie, you're up next.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the updates and the presentation. I think I just have some comments regarding some concerns. Especially what concerns me is that the CAP update itself is not CEQA compliant because it's lacking specific and detailed evidence on how the city is going to reach those GHG reduction targets, those proposed GHG reduction targets. So basically, without this specific data, all of this is kind of purely speculative. And that is especially concerning because if the city is going to incorporate these consistency elements into the building code, it will be done based on assumptions. And that does not meet the legal requirements outlined under CEQA. So, by doing this, the city could be risking litigation and maybe even the project development streamlining may end as a result of that. So I think is this just, I'm elevating that it's so important for the city to show its work and explain exactly how it's going to reach those reduction targets. In addition to, and this has been brought up before, like in addition to a comprehensive implementation and funding plan, because the more details, the better. And I hope that the city will provide more information on this, on these specific details.
Maybe I can jump in from here. Hi, everybody. Alyssa Muda, Director of Sustainability Mobility. Maxie, similar to the last climate action plan, the city has done a comprehensive quantitative analysis as part of the climate action plan, and it's documented throughout the technical appendices that articulates how those strategies would reduce, with quantification, the greenhouse gas emissions or avoid greenhouse gas emissions in the city of San Diego. And so similar to the 2015 CAP, and we will be bringing forward the climate action plan as updated with that quantification and the actions that are quantified, and then those supporting actions that we cannot quantify that supported, but all of our actions and strategies are quantified in the appendices. Thank you.
Thanks, Alyssa. And let me just note for the record that Bridget Browning with the San Diego and Imperial Counties Labor Council has joined the meeting. So Joe, if you can please mark her present. Dr. Lin.
Thank you. And thanks, Rebecca, for the presentation. A little bit follow up on what Committee Member Maxie was saying about seems like there's some disconnect. I'm just trying to understand because I have been hearing that on the one hand, like Alyssa, you mentioned that we are compliant, but then I hear from Maxi that says they aren't compliant. And I was wondering if you could just, and maybe, I don't know if it's Rebecca or others, kind of dig a little bit more into details of what the issue is. And then in my mind also maybe start with how is this CAP update or consistency, how it updated the 2015 one? Or how is it different? And I know you kind of sped through a lot of the different things, so apologies if I didn't catch it all, but I'm just trying to really understand, like, how is this in improved or updated version also meet CEQA requirements that's different in the 2015 or 2016 version? Does that make sense, my question?
Yeah, no, it definitely makes sense, Cindy. So let me maybe frame it a little bit, and Becky and Kelly can jump in to walk through those specific requirements under 15183.5 of CEQA. That's where it outlines what a qualified greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan is for streamlining of projects under CEQA. And that's just for that greenhouse gas emissions piece. The rest of the requirements would still have to be met. So comparing the two, the 2015, 2016, with both we have a climate action plan. With both we have set strategies. Those are strategies 1 through 6 now. They were 1 through 5 that are quantified to demonstrate an avoidance or reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Before it was 50% below 1990 levels. Now we are showing, trying to get to 0, which is maybe a little bit easier way for us to all do the math. You know, if we're doing an inventory, then every year, year over year, we can show how much closer we are to 0. We were able to quantify to 80% of that reduction of what we currently are emitting. And that's also consistent with the California Air Resources Board scoping plan. This is all very wonky, but I'll just kind of walk through all the pieces. From there, we, as we did with the 2015 CAP, we have those actions that we can implement to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions under each of those strategies, so kind of an umbrella or a nesting. Some of those actions are able to be quantified, some are not. It is with those actions and then the strategies we are able to quantify and demonstrate that compliance with the target that we set. So that's similar to the 2015. Where we diverge a little bit is in 2015, actually it was adopted in 2016. We had a checklist to ensure that by project implementation, we weren't frustrating the achievements of reductions within the climate action plan. In this case, since we have actually done quite a few community plan updates that have changed a lot of project types to ministerial, we've done a code amendment instead. This does 2 things. 1, by reference, it pulls the climate action plan into municipal code where it has not been before. But 2, it now makes those requirements for projects applicable to every type of project, ministerial and discretionary. So we're capturing every project type that would come in where there could be GHG emissions that would be emitted, or it would either reduce or mitigate for those emissions. So let me kind of stop there and have Becky then walk through. I think there's a slide where you have the specific requirements. Am I remembering that correctly?
Don't know that I actually had a slide that really laid out all of the
requirements. Okay, that may have was another one.
But I did mention that the CAP checklist from the 2015 CAP, and then the checklist was adopted subsequently, was intended to fulfill the project by project element of the requirements in 15183.5. And that's what the CAP consistency regulations are meant to do here. But the CAP as a whole is what is meant to fulfill all of the requirements of that section of CEQA. And I think that's the really important distinction to make, that that the project by project measures that we're having here, we're not saying that this is going to take care of all of our GHG emission reduction needs. It's just that project by project element. And as I was saying earlier, the fact of the matter is that, and this is reflected in the GHG inventory, which again is completely, will be chronicled in the appendices and such, but there will be more and more measures coming online that will apply to development projects. So, especially things dealing with strategy 1 and dealing with electrification and decarbonization and so forth, that those things will apply to new development. And there's a lot of requirements before you can bring those forward. So we're not bringing them forward at this time, but that's to say that like we'll have a whole suite of things that are going to be required, and of course the cap will be monitored to make sure that we are, meeting these goals, and you might have to make adjustments and so forth, but we definitely are doing the best that we can to meet every single part of the requirements in 15183.5.
Could I just ask a question just to clarify? I think something you said, Rebecca, about you said that the cap regulations, that the updated cap regulations will meet the 2015 cap checklist for the secret requirements, but, and this is part, and I'm sorry if I didn't get it, but you said something about, but the cap as a whole will meet all of the secret requirements. I think that's the part where I'm a little bit, maybe that's the confusion for me, is what I'm hearing is the 2015 cap checklist met secret requirements, and we updated.
Okay, I think I understand what the issue is.
Okay.
So when we were adopting the cap in 2015, there's this whole list, of course, of requirements you're supposed to make. And when we were adopting the cap in 2015, we wanted to get it adopted, and we weren't ready with the project by project, with measures that could be implemented on a project by project basis. And so that's why the cap checklist wasn't adopted until 6 months later, is because we just needed more time to develop these project by project measures. But that is just one part of all of these requirements. So we couldn't call it a qualified cap until we adopted this last part. But the fact of the matter is that the cap met all of the other requirements. It was just, we needed this project by project list of measures that could be done on a project by project basis. This time around, we're adopting everything at the same time, so we don't have to do this this subsequent action of adopting, the measures. So this time around, it can be a qualified GHG reduction plan on day one. But the fact of the matter is that the cap itself, and then now the update to the cap, it includes what are the most vital elements, which is assessing the emissions reduction, quantifying the emissions reduction that is needed, and coming up with a plan to get to that emissions reduction that substantial evidence demonstrates will get you there. So really all we were talking about with the checklist, and all we're talking about with the regulations, are just this very specific, what are actions you can take on a project by project basis. I hope that clears it up.
That's helpful.
Okay.
So, and I know how these things are always convoluted, so I appreciate you guys kind of spending the time with me, because I just want to make sure I really understand, because there's so much within each of these, and I know how much work you guys put in this, and it's hard to ask you guys, like, tell us in 15 minutes what it is, everything you've been doing for the last 10 months. So this is why I think for me, like, I want to make sure I understand it right what you're doing. So for the updated CAP version that covers all. So my question then is, and I'm sorry, this will be my last question, which is that if you actually have a project that comes forward and you're going to assess the emissions needed to meet the goal, and maybe this is the part where it's like we're not sure about quantifying. There is some part where there's still a little bit flexibility in trying to determine what is that exact quantified emissions, right? Am I asking it right? So because you can't know fully in the beginning.
Well, so we do have those quantifications in the climate action plan, and we have the actions necessary to get there. And then we've put in place the code amendment that is on a project by project basis. And I'll just say that the languages for that is specified measures or a group of measures, including performance standards that substantial evidence demonstrates, and planning has done that substantial evidence or that quantification of what each of these actions does in terms of GHG emissions, that if implemented on a project by project basis, would collectively achieve the specified emissions levels. That's where we have said, okay, when projects come through our development services department, if they meet this checklist, we know it's going to keep the trajectory that we want to go in for the climate action plan. So let me just kind of back up for a quick second. The requirements for a qualified greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan is to quantify the emissions, both existing and projected. So we've done that. Establish a level based on substantial evidence below which the contribution of GHG from activities covered by the plan would be cumulatively considerable. So we looked at the totality of those emissions, identified a level that we are going to get to, so a target, and then put substantial evidence to that appendices of how we're going to do that, quantified by the strategies, measures, and actions. Identify and analyze the greenhouse gas emissions resulting from specific actions. Again, that's in the strategies, so all the quantification. The specific measures, D is the specific measures, that's the code language, and we did a checklist last time, so we're doing a code this time. And then establish a mechanism for monitoring, and that's where we do our annual monitoring reports and inventories every year to document how we're continuing on that trajectory. So kind of checking those boxes, and I'm sorry, we did have a slide that we didn't put in today, but that really kind of walked through all those requirements to show how last time in 2015 we met those requirements and how we are again this time. Above and beyond, and I think Maxie had even mentioned this, it's great to have an implementation plan, and that's why we're working on that in concurrency to the climate action plan, because it needs to inform what we're doing, but it is not a requirement of meeting the qualified greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan. So as soon as we have all of those actions, we are going to switch right over to the implementation plan lane and get that wrapped up sooner than later.
Thank you so much.
Alyssa, thanks for that. I think that was helpful. And I assume you're working with the city attorney's office and other legal counsel to make sure that you are compliant with CEQA and other relating regulations, correct?
Exactly, yes.
All right. Maxie.
Thank you. I just have a follow-up question, but first, thank you, Alyssa and Rebecca, for just providing all the information. It is a lot, so I appreciate your time and just in your work on this. What I'm thinking is that there are. Thank you for bringing up the quantitative analysis. But my understanding is that there are numbers, and there are like this number of reduction is going to happen if these measures are taken or with these actions, but the actual mechanism of how you are evaluating whether that's like actually happening, that's missing. So the concerning thing would be, let's say if this is being basically adopted into the building code, right? How if you don't have the mechanism, how can you assure or ensure that the checklist is being accurate in that sense? You need to have a mechanism, right? Of like, this is how we get the equation of like how this is how we get to this reduction. Otherwise, you know, you can't ascertain that at the end. And then if you have all these developments happening, to then just see at the end that it wasn't accurate, that's just not the most efficient, and that's not a good use of resources and time. So that's more my concern. Like, okay, we have these numbers and this quantitative analysis, but like how did those numbers get there? So if you have any information specifically on that, I would really appreciate it.
Yeah, and also I see Planning Director Heidi Von Blum is on as well. So again, we've quantified both the climate action plan strategies, measures, and actions in the appendices. The strategies, similar to in the 2015 CAP, they had a mode share target. We have a mode share target now. We have a % of decarbonization of retrofits. We have that now. And so through our monitoring plan, we can take those very specific targets and demonstrate compliance or achievement of those over the next 12 to 13 years. So we do have that. The checklist, remember, there is no checklist anymore, so it's just the code amendment. But the code amendment's far more powerful, I think, than the checklist, in that it applies to every single type of development that is happening. Heidi, do you want to add in anything more to that? I know you're joining a little bit late, sorry.
Sure, yeah, sorry, I'm just jumping in. For those of you that I haven't had the opportunity to meet, I'm Heidi Von Blum. I'm the planning director in the planning department here. But, you know, as to your question about the quantification of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions, as Alyssa went over, those have been prepared in the technical appendices, which we welcome your review of. And then in terms of how we've identified the ensuring that new development is maintaining consistency with the overall goals and actions of the climate action plan, we have gone through each of the goals, strategies, and actions that have had those quantified greenhouse gas emissions and determined which ones would be attributable to new development projects. And so those ones we think you know, are very excited to be bringing forward this particular package because the last time around, as many of you guys know, these measures were included in what was called a CAP consistency checklist, which was only applied to discretionary projects. As we've seen, a lot of projects are processed ministerially, and we want to make sure that our regulations ensure that all new development is consistent with the climate action plan without having to go through that separate CEQA process that project may or may not be subject to. So really trying to capture a much larger portion of the projects that are being processed through our city and making sure that each of those projects is implementing the portions of the CAP that the quantified greenhouse gas reductions are based on are included in each of those development projects.
Thanks, Heidi. Dr. Litt, I'm going to recognize you for one more question, and then I'm going to move us on to the next agenda item. We've got 2 more agenda items to get through before we wrap this meeting up at 5 o'clock. So Dr. Litt.
Thank you. And I know we have lots of questions, but I think this is a really important one. And this is more just maybe like a comment or recommendation. I think, Alyssa, when you were going through all the details, I wonder if it's helpful when you send us the deck to include in there an example. I think where for me, the disconnect, and maybe for Maxie, it's that you have these targets and goals and you have very detailed strategies, actions, and measures, right? And so a project comes in, whatever project, and it is a big deal that now it's a code amendment for sure. And then you're assessing what is that GHG emission, right? So I think maybe the disconnect is a little bit of how do you get from there to determine how it's going to meet our goal. My guess is, and hearing what you said about the monitoring plan, that's a part that's really critical that probably maybe we as a committee need to understand better. Is I'm guessing that's your iterative process where you're trying to monitor. If something doesn't go right, you go back to the project developers, whoever it is, and says, hey, you're not meeting it, you must do more of this. So that's my assumption. I don't know if that's a part where you could kind of like enlighten us a little bit more, either coming back or even just in a deck. Thanks.
I'm happy to start off that, and then I'll turn it over to Alyssa. But when the Sustainability and Mobility Department does the annual monitoring of the Climate Action Plan, what the city is looking for is to determine what we've actually achieved versus what we are looking to be on target for. As part of that, if we were to say identify in one area that we were not achieving the desired greenhouse gas emissions in that area, that's something that we would want to look at in terms of increasing them with other strategies, or perhaps bringing in new strategies into the plan at that time. In terms of the specific measures applicable to new development projects, we do have to be mindful that the requirements put on new development projects can only be used to offset the greenhouse gas emissions attributable to development project, not necessarily to make up for, you know, a lack of greenhouse gas emissions on, let's say, a municipal energy strategy. But in terms of the overall monitoring, that is something that is in place to be able to ensure that through all of the 6 strategies and all of the actions, we are able to ensure that we stay on track. And Alyssa, you probably have something else to add about the monitoring as well. Thank you.
Well, no, I was just going to say, Cindy, I think that's a great idea to add more speaking points, and we'll try to put something together over the next couple of weeks, but definitely we will include that as part of our presentation at the committee hearing in June when we plan to go forward. So I think that's really great feedback and very helpful. Thank you.
All right, any other comments, questions on this item? All right, so let's move to agenda item 6. And if, Joe, you can note that Julie Kalansky with Scripps Institution of Oceanography has joined us, so please count her here. For agenda item 6, again, this is an information item. I want to turn it over to Mariah Saldana, Climate Action Plan Program Manager for the City of San Diego. Mariah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to pass it to Alyssa to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you so much. So everybody, I'm so glad that we can present a snapshot of what we've been working on with the implementation plan. It is really in the details where we will be able to look at budgets and resources needed over the next decade and beyond to ensure that we meet our climate action plan goals that we're setting forward under this very ambitious climate action plan. So what we'll do today is we'll share with you information about the process in preparing the implementation plan to date. So this is still very early in that process, but you'll see there's quite a bit of information. What you won't see is for some of the groups that have provided us letters already, we're still working on incorporating and updating some of those actions, adding more supporting actions where that seems appropriate. And so you won't necessarily see any of your edits as an organization into any of our actions made. This is definitely a work in progress. But why we did want to share this with you is twofold. One, as you're working through the next couple weeks of looking at the high-level measures and strategies and the actions, you're able to also do so in a context of what will be kind of our next step as a group on the implementation plan. So you can already be thinking about those details. And then once we have moved through the next 4 weeks of the climate action plan, and we move into the Environment Committee for presentation and consideration, we will update with the comments we received and share that complete matrix as a working draft with the Environment Committee as a public document in advance of that committee to inform decision-making on the climate action plan. Again, this implementation plan right now, it's in a matrix form. What we anticipate after the CAP is adopted, we move all of those actions plus any that were revised or amended as we move through the hearing process, build out the whole matrix as a quick reference guide, but then complete a more exhaustive document that has real discussion about all the actions, as well as funding opportunities and strategies for comprehensively funding the climate action plan. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mariah to roll up our sleeves and get into the implementation plan.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Let me know if anyone can't hear me. but it sounds like everyone can. Before we get into the implementation matrix, I did want to address a question that came up during last week's meeting on the different plans that intersect with the Climate Action Plan, and the Climate Action Plan also supports buttresses and references in the document. So there are a lot of plans here. We want to cover some of those plans again that intersect with it. These are from state requirements, a lot of them, and then also from our own planning purposes. The first one, and I would say the sister plan to the Climate Action Plan, is Climate Resilient SD. It's our comprehensive plan to prepare for, adapt, and recover from the impacts of a changing climate. So this will help the people of San Diego adapt, but also thrive in the face of extreme heat, wildfires, sea level rise, flooding, and drought. After that, we have the environmental justice element that the city's planning department is currently developing. This will develop goals, objectives, and policies to address issues for neighborhoods disproportionately experiencing pollution and other health burdens. We also have the city's first mobility master plan, which will support the implementation of the CAP mobility measures. And then that is also paired with our bicycle and pedestrian master plans. From there, we're currently developing Blueprint SD, which will be a new approach for the city's general plan and community planning efforts moving forward. This will better center climate and housing goals. We also recently updated our Parks Master Plan, which aligns with the citywide goals, again, of sustainability, resilience, equity, livability, and connectivity. Our Zero Waste Plan works to divert all solid waste from going into the landfill. We have an urban forestry plan, which supports the tree planting initiatives. And then the city's biodiverse SD encompasses the multi-species preservation program, open spaces, vernal pool conservation, and then development regulations. The urban water management plan is a description of demand, supplies, conservation activities, and the reliability of water sources over a 20-year timeframe. And then finally, we have the Portside Community Emissions Reduction Plan, which is not the city's plan. This is a plan from the Air Pollution Control District, but it contains detailed information strategies for air pollution emissions, and we do work with the agency on it. Okay, but so we can definitely come back to that for any questions, I can imagine. But now moving into the implementation plan. So the implementation plan is built to address the concerns of our advocates that are looking for a stronger emphasis on the budgetary needs of the CAP, as well as the recommendation of the 2021 audit of the Climate Action Plan. So the 2021 Climate Action Plan audit specifically called out that need for an implementation plan that includes an estimate of costs, funding sources, funding gaps, and also the leading departments for every action. So we look to develop this implementation plan that will assign pathways and set a framework for accountability for every measure. We've started to develop this implementation matrix as the CAP is out for public review. Our team has been reviewing inputs for the implementation matrix with staff over the past month, and we've been working with staff really thoroughly on this. We've been regularly also updating staff internally and working with the mayor's office on the direction of this matrix. We've also presented to various community-based organizations, including through our equity stakeholder working group. Getting a little bit more into the outreach, we've presented the perspective framework of the matrix to the Community Planners Committee, the Planning Commission, and looking forward for the Environment Committee, as Alyssa said, we will include this as an attachment to the draft CAP itself. And then at the same time, we've been bringing updates to our external stakeholders, trying to keep this process as transparent as possible. This is a part of that as well, including our equity stakeholder working group and the community-based organizations that have been working with us through our Climate Action Plan engagement efforts. So this is a initial look of the matrix, and from this slide I'm going to change my screen actually to the matrix itself, but I want to first orient you here before we get into the kind of crazy Excel. So again, the core of our implementation plan at this time is this matrix. This will be the framework for the narrative of the plan that we're looking to draft this summer, and this builds on that prioritization modeling that we did for the Climate Action Plan itself. So each of the 160 actions, more really than 160, 180 at this point, were analyzed within the city to increase accountability and transparency. And this is all has been in response to feedback that we received on that 2015 CAP. So this is really the starting point for us for addressing the fiscal concerns, which will then be further addressed in departmental work plans going forward, where we see more specific funding amounts and staff actions that will need to be laid out. Action status on these will also be regularly reported through our annual reporting process, which we've talked a little bit about today. So let me go ahead and share. So the matrix itself, once Zoom cooperates. So as we, okay, let me go here. So we plan to keep this kind of high level just during this presentation portion, but then we can definitely go on for more questions. Let me just get this so I can see it. Okay, can everyone see the matrix? Okay, excellent. So
Yes.
I want, okay, thank you. Want to orient you to all the different columns that we're looking at. So really the focus of today is talking through the framework for the matrix. I completely understand that. I think we would all love to get into specific actions and go through the inputs for those actions. But today's intention is for you to just get used to the format of it and to have an understanding of what it looks like and the kind of information that we're collecting so far. As we go through strategy by strategy in future meetings, then we can definitely dig into the weeds of those specific actions and go more into the details. So definitely, I'm not trying to circumvent any questions, just want to be respectful of everyone's time since, again, there's 180 actions, and I think we could really spend a lot of time going into the specifics for every action, and we will in the future. But just to orient you with the full matrix itself, so we start with tabs for each strategy, but we do still have a column for strategy, then a column for the measure. So each strategy has measures, and it's those measures that are quantified. So if you group the actions by measure, you'll see which actions feed into which greenhouse gas reductions. But then we do go into the meat of the plan, which are those actions themselves, the specific points that staff will be taken to implement the climate action plan. And then we move into the leading department. We've tried to narrow this down where possible to a single department, but sometimes it's just unavoidable that there are multiple departments that will be working on individual actions. From there, we get to pathways, which is what we're calling what actually needs to happen in order to accomplish that action. So it's different for every action, as you can see, but frequently you'll see in here that this includes land development code updates, or different work plan changes for how we do city processes. Status is where we are at currently, so today before the draft has even really been adopted, but some of these actions are already underway. Impacted fiscal years is when is this going to happen? Some of these, again, have already started to happen. Some of them are expected to happen in future fiscal years. For funding magnitude, we're using a high-level system at this time. We'll go further into this as the departments develop their work plans. But right now, $1 sign is less than 100,000. $2 signs is 100,000 to 350,000. $3 signs is 350,000 to 1 million, and then $4 signs is above 1 million. So the intention of this is to give staff, council, and the public a kind of rough idea of how much actions cost at this time. And then we're asking departments as we work on this whether or not they see external funding will be needed. And as you can imagine, a lot of them are yes so far, but some of the actions that are already started are no. And then we're looking beyond fiscal year 25. So for fiscal year 26 and beyond, what is the funding magnitude for that? Funding source, for the most part, it's general fund, but for some actions, we do already have grants identified for it or other funding sources. And then we get into performance metrics. So this is part of what we will be tracking every year through our annual reporting. And as you can see, every action does have a different metric that we will be reporting on as it happens.
Hey, Mariah, real quick, do you mind scrolling your, we stop at column L. Can you scroll your screen over so we can see the rest of your worksheet there?
Yeah, does this work now? Can you see N through AP?
I can't.
Not yet. No, it's not moving. Click back on the file again and see if you can back into it.
But my screen is still being shared?
It is, but it's static.
Oh, okay. Is it working now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so if I lost you then at L, so going back, so L is what external funding would be required, whether or not it would be required from fiscal year 23 to 25. N is the funding magnitude looking past fiscal year 26. Funding source, a lot of them are general fund, but for some actions, we do already have grants identified or other funds. Performance metrics will be what we are looking at for the annual reporting, and then what the departments will report on to us for the accomplishment of an action. And then we get into what went into our Climact Prio tool analysis for the prioritization of actions. That would be a whole nother hour to go into, definitely, which would be more than happy to do. But basically, we're looking at a high, medium, or low for how that action influences the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And then we asked staff internally during the draft development to rate the feasibility and both the feasibility and the potential for equitable impact of actions on a high, medium, or low scale. We were then able to aggregate that with the help of our data analysis and look into, and then put that to a 1 to 10 scale, but everything was rated high, medium, or low, not from 1 to 10. There were 5 questions that went into the feasibility score and 3 questions that went into the equity score. Our consultants at EPIC, the Energy Policy Initiative Center, and also our staff worked on the ratings for core benefits. So assigning which co-benefit is associated with every action. And again, these were developed by our public input. So we have air quality, public health, jobs within the economy, and then resiliency. And then finally, we also looked at whether or not an action was specifically called out by our communities of concern during our in phase 1 of engagement, or during our earlier phases of engagement. So we've marked yes if it was an action that was specifically asked for by our communities. So I will pause here and go back to the presentation, but we can definitely come back to this. But I know that this is a lot to absorb, completely understand. Let me go back to the presentation. So can you see my screen? Okay, so what's next? So we're going to be, again, bringing the draft matrix with the climate action plan update as an informational working draft through the hearing process, which will take place from June through July. We're also still working really heavily with our staff internally to fill out this matrix. As you may have seen, there's typos here and there. It's definitely a working draft. It's a living document that we're in almost every day, really, Joe. And then this will be, and then we're also gathering feedback, of course, through our community outreach, but then also from you all. So again, very much a living document. We can make changes to it as we move through our meetings here. And this is just one part of the implementation plan overall, and even really one part of implementation moving forward. So there was an additional audit recommendation for the development of interdepartmental work plans. So our staff are also working on an administrative regulation that will inform how departments will report annually on their progress for meeting climate action plan goals, and then also their needs to achieve those actions. And then following CAP adoption, we'll develop that final implementation plan, which will include all the information from the matrix and then more extensive information as well. So that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Mariah. Cody, if you don't mind holding, we're going to open it up to public comment before we take questions and comments from the committee members. And I will remind everyone that we are not speaking about specific implementation items for this item today. We are just talking about kind of the framework by which the implementation plan is being established, which really goes back to kind of what you saw on the spreadsheet that Mariah showed. So reminder too, we have public comment limited to 1 minute per speaker. We'll give 16 minutes total or wrap that up before. So Cody and Kyle, if you don't mind lowering your hand real quick just during public comment, and then I'll get to you once we go back. But Joe, turn it over to you for any public comment.
Thanks, Jason. If you'd like to speak during this agenda item, please raise your hand by either tapping the raise your hand icon on your tablet, computer, or smartphone, or dialing *9 on your phone. When it's your turn to speak, Jason or I will call you by name as it appears in the Zoom webinar, or I will read out the last four digits of your phone number if you've called into the meeting. Click the unmute prompt that will appear in your computer, tablet, or smartphone, or dial *6 on your phone if you are anticipating speaking by phone. Please mute your TV or computer when it is your turn to speak.
All right, Joe, thank you. Looks like Brenda, you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so once again, this is Brenda Garcia Millán from Climate Action Campaign. We once again want to highlight the need for a comprehensive implementation and funding plan with associated costs. We are concerned that without an implementation plan and specific details on how much the cap will cost, the city will not be able to identify and finance capital projects and programs needed to meet the cap targets and achieve zero carbon emissions. The city's track record on achieving even the more modest goals set in the 2015 cap are cause of concern. For instance, the city meets its residential and municipal energy use reduction target. And so this is why we urge the city to develop a comprehensive cap implementation and funding plan. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And any other public comment, Joe? Seeing none?
Correct.
All right, I'm going to close public comment on this agenda item and open it up to questions, comments from committee members. Mariah, as I'm doing that, I think it might be helpful to go back to that spreadsheet just so people can see kind of what you're tracking and how. I assume some of the questions will be just based on that, so it may be helpful to have that up. Cody, recognize you for a question or comment.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the presentations. This is fun for me, having been going through this a couple times now. I have two questions. The first one is, I think, Mariah, you talked a little bit about this, the external review of the matrix, and you mentioned wanting both feedback from us. So just want to hear a little bit more about that, and then also that you're gathering it from the community. Sorry, my dog decided to shuffle around behind me right now. So curious how that's going to go, and for example, the column on equity, is that an internal assessment? Are you talking to the stakeholder working group that you have assembled for that topic and letting them weigh in on how equitable they feel each measure is? And then what you want us to do to help with that? And then my second question is, and this is something we're going through right now too, and both of these, and how to gather input and help us prioritize our work, for us as well as under community power. But will you use this prioritization for helping this list for prioritizing projects? So for example, the highest ranked ones, are you going to cut those top 10 off and those will be budgeted for and implemented the next year or something? We did something similar like that a long time ago when I was at the Port of San Diego. We did a list like this and took the top 10 or 15 and said, this is what we're budgeting for this year and focusing on, and it helped everybody agree to a work plan. So just curious how you see implementing that. Yeah, thank you so much, Cody. And say hello to your dog for us all. So to start with the first question, so we've been bringing this, like I said, to our equity stakeholder working group throughout the development of just this matrix, as well as our community-based organizations have been working with the draft engagement. This draft will also go with our full package to Environment Committee when we see that. And then we can also take input at that time. Input has also been going into the actions through the public open house that we have going on, and then all of the different organizational letters as well. But we do see really this group as being really able to inform the framework for the matrix and then the narrative and moving forward into the implementation itself. Already this column, this community identified action, that came out of our discussions with our community-based organizations of wanting to really see from just this matrix itself, how those actions that came out of our engagement were prioritized. So this equity score, so this goes back to, we asked 3 questions of staff when they were analyzing every action, and they scored each of those 3 questions as high, medium, or low. So then throughout the process, we brought those questions to equity stakeholder working group. We did bring, we've been really transparent with the scoring for the questions themselves. They're in the appendices of the CAP, so you could see how staff scored everything to get to that. But the question of whether or not, this is really intended to identify more of what did the community specifically ask for, and then how was that reflected into the plan. I believe. Oh yeah.
Maybe I can.
Oh yeah.
Maybe I can jump in on that, on the prioritization component of the question that Cody had. That's a really good question, Cody. Our hope is that the implementation plan is a tool for everyone to use. So staff won't necessarily be going through and identifying what the priorities are without direction from the mayor, from our council, which it really needs to be that collaborative approach. And so making the implementation plan a matrix for an easy, fairly easy, digestible review, and then the more complete comprehensive document available to the public to be able to utilize the budget process, work with their council members to elevate priorities, to make decisions about if equity is your priority. You can see the quantification of equity. If GHG emissions is your kind of second tier priority, how do you shake it out from there? So it's really about the data points to make better decisions as a city as a whole.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Just real question, one real question. Couple things I was thinking as you talk about pathways, and even this may not necessarily go to the community column, but it seems to me that at some point, could you potentially address or identify external partners that would help you meet some of the goals that were established? So just looking at 3 for an example, or strategy 1 there on line 3, that brings into question work that community colleges are doing, our local universities are doing, the San Diego Workforce Partnership, our different labor councils. Are you able to think about kind of some of these internal goals that may be able to be passed on, if you will, to an external partner to help meet those goals? And I think workforce development would be a perfect example of that. Have you contemplated incorporating that at all into the matrix?
So I think that's a fantastic idea, and that's the exact kind of suggestion that we're so hopeful and grateful to have from this group. So I could see that being a really clear addition to this. So as a new column, that's potential partnerships.
Something like that. You're naming
yeah.
things.
Well,
external partners, I think, that could potentially be identified. And then second, under actions, and cost, the money to pay for the action is one thing, but also the anticipated timeline to implement that action, I think, is also something that needs to be considered as you. Is that already on there?
That's what we're looking at as impacted fiscal years for right now.
Okay, because I think too, I think as you prioritize projects, there's the funding, there's the kind of priorities, the equity component, some of those other things, but there's also just the anticipated timeline of if it's a code change or something else that needs to be thought about. I think that could potentially help identify if there's some that can be done, and the timeline can be really short to get it actually implemented versus some that are going to take a much longer process. So if that's something that could be considered as well. And then let me, Dr. Lynn, Kyle had his hand up as part of the first round. Cody, I think you may want to lower your hand if you're done. All right, Kyle.
Great, thank you. So I think that this is a really great start, and I appreciate all the work that staff's put into this tool, and also the attempt to bring this implementation matrix along with the climate action plan. And so I wanted to also point out that this part of the climate action plan, this implementation part, feels to me like a really key function of this group is to weigh in on this question of prioritization. And I think what city staff has done with this is given us a lot of data, and there is a lot of information. And I think it's important to, for this group as representative of different interests and different parts of the community, to give weight to what is really important. And I'm going to make a pitch for what I think is really important to be prioritized is there's a climate gap, there's an inequity that exists across the city in a variety of ways, but especially from the lens of climate. There's a tool that the city's developed, which is the Climate Equity Index. And we haven't, as a group, been able to go into that tool at this current point in time, which I think is a really important starting point to think about how different areas of the city, different residents living in different neighborhoods are going to be experiencing very different realities when it comes to the growing climate crisis. There's communities that are suffering from really horrible air quality. There's communities that have very poor coverage of tree canopy and so are more vulnerable to extreme heat events. And if a community like Barrio Logan, which has a 5 times higher average of respiratory issues like asthma than a community in the north part of the city like La Jolla, they're going to be more susceptible to climate events like wildfire smoke and are really most at risk. So we have this data that sort of measures the disparity, and that's sort of like step one. Can we measure all of the disparities? And the next step is to invest and prioritize the communities we know that are going to be most vulnerable. So the equity column, the equity score column is very critical to look at. So I'd love to learn more about that. I know that there was some discussions about how those questions were created and how they were being scored. So I think there's the next step after identifying all this information is to come up with policy tools to get the investments from the climate action plan to the communities that are going to be most vulnerable. And from the Environmental Health Coalition's work over the years on the climate action plan, we're really calling for a policy that dedicates investments to these communities. Based on the historical disinvestment, it should be offset to have investments go towards these communities. In addition to that policy, I think it's important to have better tracking, and I think the city can start to do this, is to track geographically where projects are being located. So CAP implementation projects, where they're located in the city. So we have a better sense of how much money is being spent in each community related to CAP implementation. And then just a general plug that there's a climate equity fund that was created last year. It would be really important for everyone that's working on the climate action plan and the city staff, city council, the mayor, to figure out how we can get more resources into the climate equity fund to advance these types of projects. One last quick note around the core benefits columns, AL, AM, AN, and AO. There's a yes or no in this matrix, and it would be fantastic if we could get greater detail. If there's a score or a scale that can be prescribed to air quality, public health, jobs, and resiliency, that way we can have a better sense of what this, how to weight those different core benefits instead of just knowing a yes or no. So those are all of the thoughts and things I wanted to raise at this time. And again, thank you for bringing this up for discussion.
Thank you, Kyle. Roberto, would you be able to go into the 3 questions that formulated the equity score?
Yeah. So, hello everyone. I'm Roberto Carlos Torres, Climate Equity Specialist, in case I don't know any of you. So the department used 3 questions to kind of sort of grade whether action would be addressing climate equity. The 3 questions, if I can remember them off the top of my head, we're looking at, is this something the community has asked for to address historical inequity? Is it something that can incorporate community engagement? or that, you know, it has a plan that identifies a plan to kind of shift engagement in a way to be more empowering to a community. And I am blanking on the third question. I always do.
Historic disparities.
There we go. Does it address historic disparity? So those were the three questions that staff were asked to kind of rank to determine whether it has an impact on equity.
Thank you, Roberto. Wanted to give that quick summary since that was the second time, and we can definitely give you all of the questions that went into the feasibility and equity scores. They're also available in the appendix for the climate action plan. And definitely as the group thinks about prioritization, completely understand if you want to go more into that climate model that we used for the draft development.
Hey, Mariah, can you touch on Kyle's point about tracking to some degree the geographic location of individual projects?
Yeah, maybe Randy or Alyssa, would you like to talk about the CIP process?
Yeah, I can start on that. There's a all great points, Kyle. Thank you. So we are working with the Department of Finance and other departments to better track how we are spending infrastructure dollars, other spending around climate action plan implementation. Depending on kind of how you look at it, a lot, maybe most of what the city spends is implementing the climate action plan, or at least should be. So it's a lot of different funding pots, a lot of different departments involved. And so it can be pretty complicated to track exactly which projects are implementing the climate action plan and where those are located. Some are citywide, some are more localized, many span different communities. But we are working with the Department of Finance to work out a process where we can identify CIP projects that identify that implement the climate action plan, and that we can geographically track those in terms of what part of the city is seeing those investments. So we can continue to report on that and make sure that we are really following through on our commitment to prioritizing equity in our communities of concern. And you'll see that language throughout the climate action plan of wanting to target first investments within communities of concern. So we need to be able to track that to be able to report on it and make sure that we're following through on that. So that's definitely something that we're continuing to work on.
Thanks for that, Randy. Dr. Lynn, before I go to you, one more. Alejandro had raised his hand earlier. I just wanted to check in, Alejandro, if your question was answered, if you still had a question.
Yeah, it was kind of answered. It was also around the prioritization, both for funding and timeline as well. If this tool would be used to prioritize which ones would be funded first, or was it more of a checkbox of like if it would be funded, one of these projects? But I think we've dove into that conversation already.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you.
Jason, if I may recommend, I think I hear a couple great ideas for future meeting topics after we get through the high-level climate action plan policies. And as we are, moving through the hearing process, we can start to shift to go over the climate equity index, and then maybe dedicate a meeting to talk about for the group to talk about prioritization ideas and recommendations. I think that those would be two really great topics that we can tuck in there later in our meetings together.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Alyssa. And as it relates to the prioritization, just thinking about kind of the council process, when would you think, I know we've kind of got our June 6th deadline for the draft climate action plan comments and feedback. When do you think, and if you can't answer it today, that's okay, that we would want to, as a committee, have our kind of ranking of projects, if you will, prioritization to submit to council for consideration?
So there's a kind of a bigger schedule of actions that are happening here within the city. The implementation plan, very important, but the implementation then feeds into individual department work plans that will be created for next fiscal year, so FY24. And we know all of that starts at the end of this calendar year. So, we get done with the budget in June and we take a short breath and we start on the next one. So it is a matter of importance of timing. I'm thinking a prioritization conversation in the early part of the fall. September, early part of September is probably a good time to, because I anticipate it's going to be a couple conversations around that and what the values are of the group and the recommendations that come out of that.
Okay, thank you. All right, Dr. Lynn, sorry, now to you.
No worries. I'm glad it got to everyone. I just have two questions. The first one I think is simple. The 180 actions here, does that cover all the 10 plus plans that Mariah introduced in the beginning, the mobility plan? Those are all plans that are offshoots from this matrix. Is that right?
So there, no, those are separate or separate documents and separate plans. So we do address some of those plans within the climate action plan, but they are separate planning documents.
So I wonder if it's possible. And so one of the things you're asking the committee to do is think about framework. But I think it would help because it's a little bit confusing to know that there are all those different other plans. And some of them, obviously, there will be overlap. And so just trying to figure out if we just only look at this matrix, like what is covered. So I don't know if those plans have things that are overlap, and if there are, and perhaps you're already doing this, to highlight what those overlaps are. I think that would be helpful because then it makes connections for those of us who are thinking about climate action plan as a whole, because it clearly, there's a lot of plans that you guys are working on, and it seems like it's not the one.
Yeah, Dr. Lynn, I think I can answer mine, but just to say real quick, as we get into the specific strategies where some of those strategies are addressed in other plans, this Mariah and others will highlight those. But I do want to stay true to the committee work here on just being on the climate action plan and our inability to influence other plans. I understand that it's informative to know what's in those plans, especially as those plans relate to specific action items or even strategies. But I think is just from what I've seen, what we'll be hearing from city staff as we move forward, going in deeper into the strategies, will be where some of those are being addressed. A great example is, let's say, the energy component is really addressed through San Diego Community Power. So we'll see where those other, where some of those action items are being addressed through either internal plans or with organizations like San Diego Community Power.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. It's not for us to speak on those plans as much as to know where the overlaps are.
Right.
And then
Go ahead.
My second point was to highlight what you said, Jason, which is I think that one of the best thing we could do as a committee, because it seems like, of course, all of this is on all of us, but it feels like it's on all of the city staff's shoulders in terms of trying to implement this. And I really, really value what you said about including a column on external partnerships. And I did include in the chat, but I want to say it also since we are recording, that if we include some kind of a column on external partnerships, it's an area where both the city, but frankly, the committee, us as the public, can highlight and ask other external parties, partners to commit to trying to achieve our targeted goal. Because it's really easy to, basically point to the people who are doing the work and to also say that they didn't do enough. But the reality is that in this city, we have to have every single person do something. And particularly, I think the private and business and the nonprofit community can actually help a lot. Now, obviously, how that works out is challenging, but I think if we incorporate like even just physically a space here, it'll perhaps provide more of that onus on the external partners to try to do more.
Thanks for those comments. Maxie.
Hi, thank you. First, I wanted to second the comments made by committee member Kyle from EHC. I think it's really important to prioritize your geographic regions that have suffered through basically historical underinvestment and marginalization and are thus experiencing higher environmental and climate health risks. So definitely want to elevate that. And now in regards to the implementation matrix, really appreciate, all the city staff's hard work in developing it. It seems like this framework is an excellent first step, towards developing a robust implementation and funding plan. So that's great. I have a specific question regarding the funding magnitude. If I remember correctly, the $4 signs indicate investments of $1 million or more. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, awesome. So do we have a number estimate, like a specific estimate, or not a specific estimate, like a number estimate of what would be the most expensive measures? Just because just saying $1 million and over, that is a very, very wide range. So it's important, I think it's important for both the community and the council to have transparency in that regard, to know exactly like how much the CAP measures will cost, so things can be prioritized in tandem with the specific needs of communities, right? Because also without a comprehensive funding and implementation plan, there could be the risk of losing out on millions in state and federal funding for CAPs. So I'm wondering how is that being balanced, such a wide range of funding?
Right, that's a great question, Maxie. I'll jump in on this one. So as you can see from the glimpse of the spreadsheet here, it talks about multiple years and then it gives dollar signs. So you would have a cumulative number for each of those items. So I'm just looking at line 3 is FY24 through FY26, and the magnitude is about 200,000, we'll say annually, year over year for 3 years. So what you're seeing here is just the matrix, and that's why the matrix is good. It's a good working document to inform as we're making these 50,000 foot level decisions about climate action plan policy and generally what that's going to look like in terms of commitments and costs and partnerships, which I also really like that. And I think that's where we move from this internal structure of the implementation plan external. But where we're going with the implementation plan is, as you can see, going from a matrix to a really more narrative, comprehensive understanding of what implementation looks like. So that will be done in kind of that next phase. Once we know all of the actions and supporting actions that the council has adopted, we can then make sure our list is complete and then move it into a more comprehensive document of understanding what the total costs are, where those big costs, where the big reductions are too, that can be found for true cost effectiveness in investment.
Thanks, Alyssa. Jesse.
Hi. First of all, I want to say that this spreadsheet's great. I appreciate focusing on implementation and on actual costs and how we're going to get there in that really fine detailed level. Sort of echo what was said before, the degree to which we can get, actual dollar amounts instead of dollar signs, or wherever it is that the information can be more specific without making it overly complicated. I think that's great. In particular, my areas are street safety is one of the areas that I focus on, and redesigning one intersection can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the amount that it will cost to do all of the changes to the streets that we need is going to be well into the millions of dollars. And so it's going to be important to have more than just, $4 signs there to understand what the magnitude is. And then also, I don't know how much time we'll have for this, but certainly on street redesigns, cost containment can be an issue, and the degree to which we can talk about really being efficient with the way that we spend money. We can talk about quick build and that kind of thing, but that's sort of where my head is on those things. So thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. Any other questions or comments from any of the committee members? All right, so Mariah, anything else to wrap up your presentation here? Sorry, Andrew, real quick. Not real quick, but Andrew.
Sorry, I jumped in. Yeah.
Good.
Okay, thanks. Just two quick things. I was thinking about, Jason, your comment about partners and wondering if it would be helpful for grants, potential grants to be listed here. And then also, along with that, if there are other city documents, this might be too specific, but other city documents or community plans that support this, so that when you're writing a grant or thinking about partners, we all have some information in this working document about what other directions are already gearing towards these particular actions. Just two ideas about making this more user-friendly for partners, as Mariah was saying at the beginning. So 2 quick ideas.
Thank you, Andrew.
You know, one thing to think about too, and I hesitate a little bit to bring this up, but I'm going to do it anyway, is, you know, what we talk about here kind of, I don't know, from maybe AH on is kind of the positive impacts of that potential action. But I don't think we're, you know, is there an opportunity to also just at least recognize any negative impacts? And I don't know what those negative impacts could be. But certain projects may not benefit everyone. There could be kind of a negative side of that, you know, whether that's increased cost of energy, increased cost of doing some sort of retrofit from the business perspective or even from the residential perspective. I think we have to think about, you know, as we move forward with this plan, is also be realistic about the plan as well, and to think about any of those maybe unintended consequences or even intended consequences. I think should be to some degree noted as well, to the extent that they can, because especially as we start thinking about prioritizing this, there may be areas or there may be some things where that may play into or that may factor into a decision as a potential negative impact of one plan or another.
I think that sounds like a good idea, Jason, that we can probably fold into maybe even at a higher strategy level within strategy 1, 2, 3. We might be able to group them together of what those unintended consequences are, or intended, like you said, so that we are recognizing them. I think there might be a way that we could roll that into the final kind of build out of the implementation plan, getting that information as we walk through with this CAP review committee and the public.
Okay, thank you. Bernadette.
Thanks, Jason. Great plan. Really love this matrix. Know a lot of work had to go into this, so just shout out to staff. Quick question though on the reduce of GHG emissions. I remember, Mariah, you mentioned about 1.9 million metric tons will be reduced thanks to strategy 1. Is that incorporating like each line item on this sheet kind of thing, or how will, because I guess, you know, I understand the difficulty in like the column AH of putting low, medium to high, but as far as like actual numbers, I kind of like the idea, and Jason, maybe this kind of goes with what you're saying, and even Dr. Alyssa, you guys were kind of getting at like, this strategy will have this result, right? And what I kind of, the reason I'm curious, you know, done our path to net zero study here at SDG&E, we saw 68 million metric tons within the state will be left over, right? That we still need to get rid of before we get to our path to net zero. So when Mariah came out with that number of like 1.9 million metric tons from strategy 1 alone, that's exciting news, right? If cities are able to actually, you know, implement all of their climate action plans, this is how we can, you know, get there. So I guess my question to you is like, will we eventually get those like individual numbers, or even just by like sections?
Thank you, Bernadette, and thank you for your compliments. It really all goes to Joe. So Joe Whitaker, who's the lead for this advisory group, has also been the lead for the implementation plan. So thank you, Joe. Yeah, so it's at the measure level that we have the greenhouse gas reductions quantified. So when you see here all of the actions that go into like the measure for decarbonized city facilities, you can also sort it, or we can sort it by the measure. We do have a specific number associated with the GHG reductions at that level. We could incorporate that, but certainly we kept it at high, medium, or low for simplicity.
And Mariah, that's in the climate action plan presently, are those numbers. So Bernadette, you know, that collective or that cumulative number is already included in the overarching measures within each strategy. More precise.
Okay. Bernadette, you good? All right. Eddie, your hand was up. It's now down. Did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. I was just, well, I have a few comments, but I'm gonna hold some of them because I don't think they're suitable for public consumption.
Thank you.
Is there any way to, as I'm looking at the people on this call, we're all from the same choir, right? And as we implement some of these processes, it's going to require everybody in the city of San Diego to be involved, at least everybody that's connected to the city of San Diego. And my main concern or hope is to start including some of the planning groups that operate in the city of San Diego, because they will have to help implement these plans, and they need to be knowledgeable of this, especially the planning groups that are located in communities of concern. We would like to bring them into the conversation to actually increase the size of the choir and get more input and more of an idea of what's going on in the city. Secondly, and hopefully lastly, when the word equity is introduced into a process, that changes the whole process, right? Most of the time, oftentimes I see equity in these charts and graphs and conversations as a checkbox, right? So we're gonna do all this stuff, and then we're gonna talk about equity and what we're gonna do equitable. In my humble opinion, and I may be speaking for other people that are like me that live in communities of concern, we look at things through a lens of equity, everything. And I would just ask and challenge the people that are on this call or other calls to actually attempt to put on lenses that are created from inequities to look at some of these processes, right? Hopefully that makes some kind of sense to people. But yeah, those are the two things that strike me. One, that we need to increase the size of the choir on these calls, because this, is important to everybody in the city of San Diego. And secondly, I don't think equity is being really treated with respect or reverence that it really deserves in these conversations. I think every strategy on this list that I'm looking at needs to be tainted with the word equity or inequity, right? So that's how we, acquire equity. Otherwise, we're just talking about equality, and we're not trying to achieve equality. We're trying to achieve equity, which means addressing immediately and first all the inequitable situations that communities have been held and are living through. And I've said this before, somebody today in Barrio Logan is getting the news that your child has asthma while we're sitting up here having these conversations about what we're going to do. And to me, that's how serious this is. It's not just, we're going to do this and get this done. People are dying and their lives are being changed because of climate inequities. And we need to do something brand new and quick. And I'm going to shut up now because I haven't cussed yet, but I feel one coming.
Thank you for sparing us. But thanks for those comments, Eddie. And obviously your perspective. I will say, Mariah, going to Eddie's point on the community planning groups, is that noted? I thought I heard you say that, but I don't know if it's in here. But that's another thing, is maybe just I guess that goes back to some of the geographical stuff that Kyle brought up earlier. But how certain community planning groups may be included, or what planning groups may be included in some of these specific items, that may be worth calling that out as part of this matrix, especially as we think, and maybe that's part of that kind of external, not necessarily external, but that community kind of partner relationship, and noting that we talked about earlier. But let me keep us on time. Sorry, we've got only a couple more minutes here, and I want to make sure that we get to our next agenda item. Any other comments, questions on this? Ed, is your hand back up, or did you forget to lower it?
I forgot to lower it. Sorry about that.
No worries. Okay, so let me go to close the comments on just this item 6 and move on to item 7, which is another action item, our last action item and item of the day. Just want to get, based on our conversations from our last meeting, this was the agenda that we drafted based on the input we got from all of you. And so wanted to adopt this for our next meeting. But before making that motion or asking for that motion, I wanted to open up if there's any questions or comments from the committee members on this. Just real quick, just to refresh your memory, 2 information items, which will be a deeper dive into those individual climate action plans and the associated implementation items. We wanted to do both strategy 2, clean and renewable energy, paired with strategy 3, mobility and land use, at our next meeting. And then we'll approve our agenda for the following meeting at our next meeting, but that one would be strategy 1. So with that, Kyle, you have a question?
Yeah, I kind of referenced this earlier, but I don't see where the committee is going to be getting an overview of the climate equity index. And if we're going to be discussing, these strategies, and we got an overview of the implementation matrix, starting with the climate equity index might be a helpful place to start to frame some of these conversations. So is that possible to add to an upcoming agenda?
Well, I think you raised a good point that we should probably do it at our next meeting. I want to be cognizant of the time. Mariah, from your perspective, or Roberto's perspective, could we, after the approval of minutes at our next committee meeting, get an overview of the climate equity index before we go deeper into strategy 2 and strategy 3?
It would be very tight for time. I would think that we would want to give at least 30 minutes to each item, and even that feels pretty conservative for both the climate equity index strategy 2 and strategy 3. So we can certainly, but do keep in mind that it will be tight.
Okay. Let me ask this: is there a way to? I agree with Kyle that I do think it's important to at least have an overview prior to getting a little bit deeper into the strategies, and maybe if that can be just, for time's sake right now, kind of a higher level overview, I think that would be appropriate. And then if we want to dig a little bit deeper into some of the different items within the climate equity index, we could do that at a later meeting. But I'm just looking at Kyle's note here. I think if we could set aside 15 minutes at our next meeting to get an overview of the climate equity index, I think we could
do that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we could do an overview in 15 minutes, and then definitely we can put an opportunity in another meeting beyond the next kind of 4 meetings to come back to the climate equity index, revisit it, and then talk about it with respect to CAP implementation.
Okay.
And dig in a little bit deeper and answer questions more fully, and explore that more.
Okay. Thanks, Alyssa. Any other questions, comments on the agenda for next week? Okay, so if I can get a motion for adoption, Kyle, I'm going to ask you to make that motion with your suggestion of including a 15-minute overview on the climate equity index, if you don't mind doing that.
Yeah, motion to approve the next meeting agenda with the addition of a 15-minute item on the climate equity index overview.
Perfect.
I second that.
Thank you, Eddie. So we got a motion by Kyle, second by Eddie, to approve this agenda with a modification of adding a 15-minute item on the an overview of the climate equity index. Joe, I don't need to do a roll call vote, or correct? I can just ask for a group vote here.
That's correct.
Okay. So all in favor of that, please say aye.
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 All right, thank you all. The agenda for our next meeting is adopted as modified. All right, so we are right at 5 o'clock. That concludes our meeting for today. I adjourn the meeting, and we will see all of you for our next meeting, which will be May 18th from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock p.m. here. So thank you all for your questions, comments. Reminder, if you do want to send individual comments to the city from your respective organization, please do that directly to Mariah, hopefully this week if you can. All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
I'm afraid to end it, but I guess I will.